Grammar recap. Welcome to your grammar crash course. English is a funny language. The way we speak is not always acceptable in formal correspondence. This poses a problem for most of us, as we often write what sounds right, but the truth is, sometimes that is not formal enough or is even outright wrong. This presentation will examine a few of these niggly areas so that we can write more formally in the future. Simple sentence structure, or subject-verb-object. All sentences need a subject and a finite verb. Check to see if there is a who or what doing the verb to find your subject. And a sentence can also be broken down as subject and then predicate, which is the rest of the sentence, the verb and possibly an object. A finite verb can stand alone and does not need a helping verb. He runs. He is the subject, runs is the verb. All sentences need a finite verb. Infinitive verbs preceded by to, for example, to run, also need a finite verb before them. Here's an example. She wants to run. Modal verbs, which ones might, should, could, must, can I use? These are helping verbs, also known as auxiliary verbs, and they help the verb and include modals like should and must, which help us determine whether something is a suggestion or a request or an order. Johnny must do his homework is very different to Johnny should do his homework. Modal verbs are useful in correspondence, as it is obviously more polite to say that Johnny should do his homework, but it would give more weight to the sentence to say that Johnny must do his homework. A phrase exists within a sentence conveying a single idea but cannot stand alone. It is also known as a sentence fragment. For example, hates getting his hair cut. The subject's obviously missing, and so this is a phrase. Phrases can act as verbs. The boy passed the exam with flying colours. They can act as nouns. Every boy on the field had to run the relay. They can act as adjectives. The boy with the lightning fast reflexes played basketball. And they can act as adverbs of time, place, manner, reason, and concession. The two examples I've got here: time, the boy got to school at 8 a.m. and place, the boy was at school doing his project. So they can't stand alone, unlike clauses which can. A compound sentence has two or more finite verbs. It is often made up of two main clauses which can stand alone as simple sentences, joined by a coordinating conjunction, because it's coordinating the two separate clauses and giving them equal weight. They're both main clauses. A complex sentence has a main clause, or a simple sentence, and one or more subordinate clauses. These are clauses which cannot stand alone because of a subordinating conjunction. It subordinates the clause, so that it is reliant then upon the main clause to make sense. Jack was nervous for the interview and he only had one jacket. These are both main clauses. They can stand alone, but we've decided to join them with comma and, the coordinating conjunction and. His jacket needed ironing, could stand alone, and Jack could not wear it to the job interview, could stand alone. Those are both clauses. But by subordinating the first clause with the subordinating conjunction since, it now relies on the second clause in order to make sense. And I really like this example because it just shows that some subordinating conjunctions can start sentences, like since and however. That's fine. They can be at the beginning of the clause or the sentence. Fanboys is the acronym for coordinating conjunctions and helps us remember which are coordinating and which are subordinating. There are too many subordinating conjunctions to memorize easily, so we learn the coordinating conjunctions and then you'll know what kind of sentence you're dealing with. And they are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. These conjunctions can also join main clauses in phrases. You can use a semicolon in place of a coordinating conjunction. Do not use a comma to join two independent clauses or two main clauses. This error is called comma splicing. So for example, Jack went to the shop, comma, he took his mother's car. Should read, Jack went to the shop, semicolon, he took his mother's car, or Jack went to the shop, comma, and he took his mother's car. Moving on to understanding subject and object in a sentence, one of the most common questions is when to use me and when to use I in a sentence. Once you have found the subject, the who or the what, doing the action or the verb, you can determine when to use I and when to use me. The subject does the action and the object receives it. So in the subject position you would use I, and in the object position you would use me. Jack and I went to lunch, and if you drop Jack it would still make sense. It would be I went to lunch, and so that's correct. In that sentence we would use I. Jack went to lunch with Sally and me. Jack is going to lunch, and Sally and me are in the object position. If you drop Sally and you had put I in that sentence, Sally and I, it would be Jack went to lunch with I, which doesn't make sense. So if you're confused, just drop the other name and check to see that it still makes sense. Jack went to lunch with Sally and me is correct. Who or whom? This is very similar to the me or I question. Once again, in the subject position use who, and in the object position use whom. Rearrange the sentence if you're confused about who is doing the verb. To whom are you speaking? So the you is doing the speaking, and therefore the whom is actually in the object position. You is the speaker, and therefore whom is the object. You can rearrange the sentence if it'll help, but it does become a little unwieldy. You are speaking to whom? Who is speaking? Who is the speaker or the subject? Next we're going to look at Concord, and Concord also means agreement, and so essentially what we're doing is making the verb and subject agree, or the subject and subject agree, or in fact anything in the sentence agree. And what that means is, for example, with the verb and subject agreement, every verb in a sentence must agree with its subject. And so singular subject would attract a singular verb, and a plural subject would attract a plural verb. You might say Roger has been invited to lead this excursion, but if you said Roger and I, you would have to then have a plural verb. You would say Roger and I have been invited to lead this excursion. Two or more nouns or pronouns joined by and the verb is plural. You and I are or were or have. If the subject consists of two nouns but mean one thing, then the subject is singular, and this can be a little confusing. The example I've given here is bacon and eggs is her favorite breakfast. Try to think of it as sort of one concept, the bacon and eggs concept, the breakfast, bacon and eggs. Another example might be fish and chips or bangers and mash. They're sort of one idea, and so they're singular. Two subjects joined by with or as well as, and the verb agrees with the first subject. The hen with the chickens is lost. So we're going to, the verb is going to agree with the hen, which is singular. Two subjects joined by either or, neither nor, or, and the verb agrees with the subject nearest to it. Neither the pupils nor the teacher is disappointed. Teacher is closest to the verb, so it's singular, and so we use is. Neither the driver nor the passengers, which is plural, were hurt. The leader or his friends are to blame. Indefinite pronouns are always followed by a singular verb. Each, every, everyone, everybody, no one, nobody, nothing, something, somebody, everything, anyone, anything. Everybody is invited to the party. Everybody are invited to the party is clearly wrong. It doesn't sound correct. Every one of you has done your share. Be careful, because a few indefinite pronouns are in fact plural, but I think they're pretty obvious. Both, few, many, and others are obviously plural. Collective nouns take a singular verb unless the collective noun is plural. So the swarm of bees is one thing. The swarm of bees was aggressive. However, the flocks, plural, of birds were impressive in their migrations through the various weather conditions. And then be careful again, because the collective noun might not be the subject. So running past the flocks of sheep is exhausting for the sheepdog. So somebody is running past the flocks of sheep. Active and passive voice. When can or should you use the passive voice? It can be used when you want to focus attention on the person or thing affected by the action. Normally the performer of the action or the agent comes first and is made the subject of the verb, and then we use the active form of the verb. The other person or thing is made the object. Consider these examples. The boss invited her to the party. The construction company in Station Road employs 300 people. However, if you want to focus on the person or thing affected by the action, you would make the person or thing the subject and use the passive voice. She was invited to the party by the boss. The boss is doing the inviting. So in fact, to make it the passive form, the boss would have to be at the beginning. But in this case, we've made it passive. We've made it passive by putting the object in the subject position. 300 people are employed by the construction company in Station Road. The construction company are doing the employing. And so moving the subject to the object position makes that sentence passive. So when would you use the passive voice? We often prefer to use it when we don't know who the agent is. I don't know who did it, but my pet rabbit has been let out. Instead of, I don't know who did it, but someone has let out my pet rabbit. I had the feeling that I was being followed instead of, I had the feeling that somebody was following me. It's just easier to leave if you don't know who the agent is, to use the passive voice. We often prefer to use it when it's obvious to the listener who the agent is. I had been instructed to remove all the ashtrays instead of, my boss had instructed me to remove all the ashtrays. It's unnecessary. It must have been the boss. She discovered that she was being paid less than her male colleagues. She discovered that the firm was paying her less than her male colleagues. And the second example is actually quite a good one, because by not directly naming the firm, it avoids being an overt criticism. So the passive voice is very useful in that example. We use the passive voice when it's not important to know who the agent is. Do you want a lift? No thanks, I'm being collected. Instead of, no thanks, someone is collecting me. And then we often prefer to use it when the agent has already been mentioned. In the next session of Parliament, new laws will be introduced aimed at stopping domestic violence. In the next session of Parliament, the government will introduce new laws aimed at stopping domestic violence. Mentioning Parliament makes it quite obvious that it's the government that will be introducing the laws. We also use the passive voice when people in general are the agents. All the Beatles records can be borrowed from the Central Library. You can borrow all the Beatles records from the Central Library. Apostrophe, catastrophe, possession and contraction or omission. Use the apostrophe with an S to show possession. Jack's bag, the dog's tail, the teacher's frowns. Or use the apostrophe to indicate that letters or spaces have been removed in a contraction. Sheared for she had, can't for cannot, and should have for should have. Use its in place of it is, and then don't use the apostrophe and its to indicate possession, and that's as difficult as that gets, I think. Tense, past, present, future plus aspect. I'm not going to go over the past, present, and future tense because I think those are pretty obvious. But I'm going to be looking more closely at aspect. So use the present or present perfect tense to indicate a current or regular action. Present tense, verb, singular, and then present perfect tense has or have plus past participle. James goes to the library every day where he has gained academic discipline. Use the past perfect to indicate a past action that occurred before another past action. James had studied grammar rules for over an hour before someone mentioned that the test was only next month. And so the past participle had studied, the past participle ed. Use the continuous tenses to indicate an ongoing action that occurs as another action happens. James was reading when he fell asleep. Okay, and here we're using an ing ending for the verb. Was reading, it's continuing, it's still happening. Or it was still happening. Misplaced modifiers. This can be a word or a group of words, and a modifier describes or clarifies or gives more detail about other words in a sentence. So when they've been misplaced, then it makes a sentence awkward or unintentionally humorous, you might also call this ambiguity. So we want to try and avoid ambiguity and make sure that the words describing some detail are in the correct place and describing the correct thing. Raymond wore his only collared shirt to the job interview, which was unfortunately stained with yellow mustard. Which was unfortunately stained with yellow mustard is an adjective or an adjectival clause. And the sentence above it is describing the interview, the noun in front. But an interview can't get stained with mustard. So obviously he meant that actually belongs to the collared shirt, that description. Professor Jones, who was late with another essay, waited for the slacker student. Who was late with another essay is an adjectival clause. In this sentence, it is describing Professor Jones, the noun before it, but he's not the identified slacker, the student is. Make sure your adjective or adjectival clause describes the correct noun by placing it carefully to avoid ambiguity. And finally, we're going to go over a few tricky words. Sometimes the issue is spelling, but very often homonyms cause trouble. So in other words, the words might be spelt and sound the same, or might actually just be homophones, where they're spelt differently but sound the same, and a lot of issues arise from that. Accept versus accept. Accept as a verb means meaning to agree to take something. For example, I always accept good advice. And then accept is a prepositional conjunction, which means not including. I teach every day except Sundays. Advice with a C versus advise. Advice is a noun, meaning that it's an opinion that someone offers you, so it's a thing. For example, I need someone to give me some advice. Advise is the verb. For example, I advise everybody to be nice to their teacher. So an easy way to remember this is in English, the noun form ends in ICE and the verb form will often end in ISE. Think of practice and practice. Affect versus effect is very confusing for a lot of people. Affect is usually a verb or an action, and effect is usually the noun or the thing. If it's something you're going to do, use affect. If it's something you've already done, use effect. To affect something or someone, to influence or act upon or change. For example, the noise outside affected my performance. To have an effect on something. Effect is followed by the preposition on and preceded by an article like an or the. To have an impact on something or someone. His smile had a strange effect on me. Effect can also mean the end result. For example, the drug had many adverse side effects. All right versus all right. It has many meanings. It can mean okay, acceptable, or unhurt. The single word spelling is actually not accepted as standard, but that's the funny thing about English. Words from being used often gain traction and become acceptable. So we see how Graham King, the Times Writer's Guide for 2001, says that it's being used so often that it's actually become acceptable. And then a lot, and a lot. A lot, two words, meaning a large amount or a number of people or things, can be used to modify a noun. I need a lot of time to develop the website. The second version, a lot as one word, doesn't exist. It's completely incorrect. And then the third version, A-double-L-O-T, is a verb, which means to give, especially a share of something. For example, we were allotted a desk each. Already versus already. Already means completely ready. For example, are you all ready for the test? Already is an adverb that means before the present time. For example, I asked him to come to the cinema, but he had already seen the film. Or are you buying Christmas cards already? It's only September. All together versus all together. The two-word version is an adverb meaning together in a single group. The waiter asked if we were all together. And the second adverb, altogether, as one word, means completely or in total. She wrote less and less often and eventually stopped altogether. To be in the altogether is an old-fashioned term for being naked. Anyone, two words versus anyone. The two-word version means any single person or thing out of a group of people or things. I can recommend any one of the books on this site. Anyone means any person. It's always written as one word. For example, did anyone see that UFO? A part, one word versus a part, two words. A part is an adverb separated by distance or time. For example, I always feel so lonely when we're apart. But a part is a two-word noun, a piece of something that forms the whole. part of the whole. For example, they made me feel like I was a part of the family. Been versus gone. Been is the past participle of be, and gone is the past participle of gone. Been is used to describe completed visits. So if you have been to England twice, you have travelled there and back twice. If you have gone to England, you have not yet returned. Now you have been and gone and done it. Borrow versus lend. Lend meaning to hand out for a certain length of time usually. Banks lend money, libraries lend books. My mother lent me some money and I must pay her back. But to borrow would be to take. So one is to give and one is to take. Borrow would be to take with permission usually. You can borrow money, you can borrow books. I borrowed some money off my mother and I must pay her back. For a happy life, never a borrower nor a lender be. Complement versus complement. Complement with an E is a verb, which means to make something seem better or more attractive when combined. So there's in effect a contrast. The colors blue and green complement each other perfectly. Complement is a noun with the version with an I, and it means to remark that a remark that expresses approval. For example, it was the nicest compliment anyone had ever paid me. If you're having a problem, try this trick. If it complements something, it completes it with an E. If I like compliments, think of it as with an I like. Okay, council and council. Council is a group noun. It refers to a group of people. For example, the local council has decided not to allocate any more funds for the project, whereas counsel can be a verb, which means to give advice. You would counsel someone. For example, she counsels the long-term unemployed. Counsel can also be a noun which means advice. For example, I should have listened to my father's counsel and saved some money. And then, of course, there's the version that means advocate, which is also spelled with an S. Fewer versus less. Use fewer for countable things like people. There were fewer people at the show. Use less for uncountable things like flour. Use less flour and your cake will rise. The same applies to number and amount. A number of people went to the show. The amount of flour in the recipe made the cake too doughy. Everyday versus everyday. Everyday is one word meaning ordinary, like this example. The everyday groceries like milk and bread cost the most when you add it all up. And then everyday is two words, means every single day. Loose versus lose. Lose, beg your pardon, is an adjective. If something isn't fixed properly or it doesn't fit because it's too large, it's loose. Loose is an adjective. If something isn't fixed properly or it doesn't fit, for example, my headphones weren't working because a wire was loose. Lose is a verb that means no longer possess. So a lot of people will lose their jobs if there is a recession. Quite versus quiet is a common spelling mistake. She was quite surprised when her students did not do their homework. Be quiet and do your work. Stationary versus stationary. The stationary train with an A wasn't going anywhere because it was still, and then stationary cost a fortune. So pens and pencils can cost a fortune. And that is the end of the grammar recap. Thank you for listening.